The album, simply titled Metallica, but much better known as the Black Album, saw the band evolve to become arguably the biggest rock band in the world. Songs like Enter Sandman, The Unforgiven, and Nothing Else Matters took over the airways of radio stations that would never have dreamt of playing a metal band just a year prior. That's not to say they've surrendered their hard edge either. The album features some of their hardest riffs. Sad But True is a great example of them sounding bigger and heavier than they ever had. Coming off the back of the very intricately arranged and hard-edged sound of And Justice for All, the band was seeking a different approach for the next album. With the controversy of the missing bass amongst other concerns, James and Lars felt they needed some assistance in getting the right sonic balance. Bob Rock was earmarked to be that guy that could help them with this, after the band were impressed with his work on Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood album. The only problem is that he didn't want to just mix the album, he wanted to produce it. The band were initially reluctant, but relented with Lars saying, "We felt that we still had our best record in us, and Bob Rock could help us make it. If he could, he was going to have to break down the walls the band put up around themselves when it came to accepting ideas from outside the four members." Bob remembers the first few months being extremely hard to get the band to trust him, with this period basically being about getting to know each other. While the band was still adamant on keeping their arrangements for the songs, they did let him in on influencing the tempos, the sonic arrangements, with suggestions for different instruments, also different microphones to suit the delivery of the performance, especially on vocals. Another key element he introduced was the insistence of live playing to create a vibe with musical moments of musicians interacting with each other. The band's normal working method was that Lars would spend as much time as possible creating the perfect drum tracks, and then build the song piece by piece and section by section around this. Although they still did heavy editing to pick the best parts, these parts essentially came from performances of the band and not in complete isolation. The recording took place at one-on-one studios in LA and lasted for a total of 9 months, with the band and producer seeking the best sounding album they could make. Starting with the drums, Lars played a rented 80s Gretsch kit with Tama bell brass snare and a mixture of Zildjian and Sabian cymbals. This was mic'd up with a heck of a lot of mics. For the kick drum, they had the Electro Voice RE20, the Sennheiser MD421 and a Neumann FET 47 further out. The snare had a Neumann KM86 on top, with a Shure SM57 on the bottom. The toms had Sennheiser 409s on the top and MD421s on the bottom. The hi-hat was mic'd with a Shure SM7 and each cymbal with an AKG 451. The overheads were Neumann U87s. There was an array of room mics, with a single AKG C414 as a mono rear room mic, a pair of AKG C414s in an XY setup, both on the front left and right of the kit. 2 AKG C12 tube mics were used as close rooms, mostly focused on the kick area, and 2 Telefunken Elam 251E tube mic as far room mics. Some kick and snare samples were likely used also, along with the recorded drums. This impressive collection of mics, plus the room itself, gave the drums a huge sound through natural room reverb, setting the sonic stage for a much more expansive sound than they'd ever had before. To complement the drums, the guitars were also much wider and layered with many different parts, played on different instruments, with the intention of creating a wall of guitars. Hetfield's main guitars were still his ESPs, but Bob encouraged him to thicken these parts using a plethora of different guitars. For example, Hetfield used a Dan Electro Jerry Jones baritone to add weight to the muted chugs of the Sad But True riff. A Gretsch White Falcon was used for some of the clean parts of Nothing Else Matters, and a Fender Telecaster with a B-bender was used on My Friend of Misery. A Dan Electro Coral electric sitar was used on Wherever I May Roam. For acoustics, the Gill 12-string was used, most notably on Nothing Else Matters. Bob did try to get him to use different amps, but this wasn't quite as successful, with Hetfield remembering. "We tried a bunch of amps, but I ended up using the same modified Mesa Boogie Mark II C+ that I'd used on the last 3 albums. In Los Angeles, there are a million amps you can try out, but none of them are up to snuff." Bob also brought in a bunch of crappy looking vintage amps. We gave everything a shot and ended up with the same old stuff. We did use a couple of vintage amps for texture, but I wasn't about to play a rhythm part through a Fender or Super amp. We sure as hell weren't making Led Zeppelin 1. He was pleased about one amp that Bob suggested though. Having lost his beloved Jose modded Marshall Super Lead that he used on Kill 'Em All, the loss of which is rumoured to be in part the inspiration for the song Fade to Black. Hetfield was delighted though when Bob Rock presented his Jose modded Marshall, and he was able to use that for the recording to accompany the Mesa. Kurt remembers what he played. I used two guitars, a Strat-style ESP with two EMGs, and an '89 Gibson Les Paul Deluxe with two EMGs also. The way I settled on those guitars is pretty funny. At the beginning of the recording process, I laid down one of my solos 15 times, using 15 different guitars. Then I listened to each track, and without knowing which guitar was which, selected the tone that sounded the best. I finally narrowed it down to the ESP and the Les Paul. I used a Bradshaw preamp for the lows and mids, and a couple of Marshalls for the nice clean highs. We EQ'd it through the board a little bit, and it worked out great. Kirk was also still using the ADA MP1 preamp, as you can see here. His effects included the Ibanez TS9 Tube Screamer and Vox Wah. The effects loop used by Hetfield contained the two Aphex EQF 2 EQ units and an Aphex CX1 compressor. The EQ was used to cut out the 1.2 kHz frequency for that smiley face EQ sound. He also made use of the EBO for those long sustain notes. All this was being fed into several different variations of cabinets, but mostly Marshall 1960 4x12 cabs, containing Celestion Vintage 30 speakers. The guitar cabs were mic'd up with a variety of different mics depending on the tone they were going for, with the Shure SM57, AKG 414s and Neumann U87s all used. These were lightly plugged into Bob's own Neve preamp racks. With Bob on board, it was time for Jason to shine. After the controversy of his buried bass on the Injustice for All album, and to celebrate, he expanded his palette of tones. His basses included the Spectre NS2, his 5-string Zom bass used to record Until It Sleeps, plus a few alembics and a Fender Precision used on the Unforgiven. His amp remained the Ampeg SVT into Marshall and Ampeg cabinets that were situated in the live room while Jason played in the control room. His picking was so loud in the control room though, that they had to erect a foam screen to dampen it for the producer and engineers who were listening to the recording. While Hetfield is famous for using the Shure SM7 for vocals, he was encouraged to branch out more on this album, as you can see here, using the Neumann U47 to get a more nuanced recording, particularly on Nothing Else Matters where the vocals are a very prominent part. Bob was definitely influential in getting Hetfield to record more harmonies than ever before, and think about the dynamics of his vocal performance. All this helped to enrich the melodic aspects and definitely bring more commercial appeal. With percussion overdubs and orchestral strings added by Michael Kamen, the sound they created was nothing like they'd done before, although a last-minute technical issue nearly derailed the final release, with the analog masters having an issue on playback. Luckily they had the DAT masters with them, which were used instead, and while pleased with the result, they were also nervous as to how it would be perceived by their hardcore fans. Their worries were quickly quashed by widespread acclaim though, with both the metal and mainstream press heaping praise on the band's ability to pull it off, with Entertainment Weekly saying that Metallica may have invented a new genre of progressive thrash. Today songs like Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters are regarded as true rock classics, and the band's legacy is cemented as one of the greatest rock bands of all time.